The sun had barely climbed above the horizon, casting a pale, uneven light across the dusty grounds of the town square. The air was thick with the smell of hay, sweat, and anticipation. Wooden stalls lined the open space, some draped with colorful fabrics, others bare and weathered. Farmers, traders, and curious townsfolk gathered in clusters, their voices rising and falling like waves as they exchanged rumors, haggled over livestock, and whispered about the strange items up for sale that day. In the center of it all, on a raised platform made of rough-hewn planks, stood the auctioneer, his voice booming over the crowd, commanding attention and respect. Among the items listed for sale, there was one that drew stares not of admiration, but of confusion, pity, and in some cases, cruel amusement. A young girl bear, shivering and abandoned, stood on the platform, her arms wrapped around herself as if she could shield her fragile body from the cold, both physical and emotional. Her wide eyes scanned the crowd, searching for something familiar, someone who might care, but there was no one. Only strangers, their gazes heavy with judgment, curiosity, or indifference. She felt invisible, yet painfully exposed, as though every whispered comment and sideways glance were a spotlight magnifying her humiliation. The auctioneer waved his hands, trying to attract attention. "Who will bid?" he called, his voice sharp and commanding. But there was silence, broken only by a few murmurs of discomfort from the crowd. One man shifted uneasily on his heels, shaking his head, muttering something about not worth the trouble, while another smirked and shrugged. The girl flinched at each sound, her heart hammering as she clutched her arms tighter. She had been through hardships before, but nothing prepared her for this public display. The feeling of being treated not as a human being, but as a commodity, to be discarded if unwanted. Children in the crowd gawked openly, some pointing, some laughing quietly behind their hands. A few of the adults tried to look away, uncomfortable with the blatant injustice, but even their pity carried a sting of helplessness, the kind that reminds the abandoned that no one can truly intervene in time. The platform felt taller, and the town square wider, as if the very space conspired to amplify her isolation. She shifted her weight from foot to foot, hoping desperately that anyone would step forward, offer a kind word, a small gesture, something to break the weight of loneliness pressing down on her. Around the edges of the crowd, a few women whispered among themselves, shaking their heads in quiet disapproval. "Poor child," one murmured. "Look at her. Not a soul will take her." Their words, though soft, cut deeper than the auctioneer's calls. The girl's throat tightened, and for a moment she closed her eyes, wishing she could disappear entirely. The shame was suffocating, a heavy blanket she could not shrug off, and yet she had nowhere to run. Every step away from the platform would be a step into uncertainty, a plunge into a world that had already abandoned her once. The auctioneer's gavel pounded the wood again, punctuating the empty air. "Anyone? Surely someone will give her a home." His tone carried an edge of frustration now, the expectation of a sale mingling with disbelief at the crowd's silence. But the murmur of "not today" and "not worth it" rippled through the onlookers. One by one, the hopeful glances that the girl had dared to cast evaporated, leaving only the hollow ache of rejection. Each refusal was not just a denial of purchase, it was a declaration that she did not belong, that she was unwanted, and perhaps even unworthy. And yet, amid the harsh eyes and judgmental whispers, there was a strange stillness at the edge of the crowd. A lone figure stood slightly apart from the rest, observing quietly, without rush or commentary. There was a calmness in him that contrasted sharply with the chaotic energy of the auction. His gaze lingered on the girl, not with curiosity, not with mockery, but with a quiet consideration that seemed almost foreign in this place. While everyone else turned away, spoke, or laughed, he remained, an anchor of silence in the storm of rejection. It was here, on that rough wooden platform in the middle of a crowded, indifferent town, that her story hung precariously between despair and salvation. She was naked, exposed, and unwanted, a human being reduced to an object, waiting for the world to decide her fate. The crowd might see only her vulnerability, but somewhere in the quiet corners of the square, someone was beginning to see her humanity. The moments dragged on, each one heavier than the last. The auctioneer's voice, once commanding, now seemed almost desperate as he repeated the offer, urging the crowd to bid. Surely someone will take her. She's young, healthy, anyone can see she has potential. But his words fell flat, echoing against the indifferent faces that surrounded him. Whispers of "not worth it" and "let her be" circulated, and no hand rose, no coin clinked on the wooden counter. The girl's stomach knotted with fear and humiliation. Each passing second deepened the pit of loneliness inside her, as if time itself were conspiring against her. Stretching moments of rejection into an eternity. Her arms, wrapped tightly around herself, began to tremble, not just from the chill that settled in the dusty morning air, but from the helplessness that gnawed at her spirit. She had learned to endure hardship before, but this public display, this bare exposure before strangers, was a cruelty she could neither anticipate nor escape. The murmurs of the crowd felt like daggers, each word a reminder that she was unwanted, that she existed only to be judged and discarded. Her eyes scanned the crowd frantically, looking for any sign of kindness, any spark of human decency, but found none. Only curiosity, indifference, or mockery met her gaze. One man leaned forward, smirking, whispering something crude to a companion. A group of children laughed, nudging each other as they pointed. Even some of the adults, who had initially lingered with a semblance of concern, now turned away, unable or unwilling to intervene. Their pity, thinly veiled and half-hearted, only deepened her sense of isolation. She pressed her palms against her bare chest, trying to shield herself from the world's cold judgment. But there was no escaping the truth. She was alone, naked, in more ways than one, and utterly unwanted. The auctioneer's tone sharpened as he tried another appeal. She needs a home. Surely someone will see she deserves a chance. But the crowd shifted, murmuring among themselves about the trouble she might bring, about the responsibility no one was willing to shoulder. Their voices, filled with practicality and self-interest, left no room for compassion. Each passing moment confirmed her worst fears. She was invisible, insignificant, and disposable. Her mind raced. Memories of prior hardships surfaced, small instances of neglect, whispers of abandonment. Doors closed in her face, but nothing had prepared her for the raw, unfiltered rejection she faced now. She wanted to shrink into the platform, to vanish beneath its wooden planks, to escape the scrutiny and judgment. But she couldn't. She had nowhere to go, no sanctuary to retreat to. Her body ached from the chill and tension, but it was the ache in her chest, the sharp, relentless sting of being unwanted, that was almost unbearable. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and unbidden, threatening to spill. She blinked rapidly, desperate to hold them back, but even in that futile effort, her vulnerability was on full display. Each person who looked away, each laugh and whispered comment, became a reminder of the cruel world she had been thrust into. She wanted to scream, to demand someone see her as more than a commodity, but the words caught in her throat. She was powerless, at the mercy of a crowd that had no interest in mercy. And yet, amid the sea of rejection, there was a faint, almost imperceptible shift. At the edge of the square, partially obscured by the throng of townsfolk, a solitary figure lingered. Unlike the others, he said nothing, laughed at nothing, and seemed uninterested in joining the conversation or bidding. Instead, his gaze was fixed on her, not with judgment, not with mockery, but with something quieter, deeper. Something that whispered possibility, though she did not yet know it. Her despair was still overwhelming, but in that single, silent gaze there was the barest hint of hope. Not the hope that she could be sold, or that the crowd would change its mind, but the fragile, tentative hope that someone somewhere might recognize her as human, might see past the nakedness, past the abandonment, and acknowledge her worth. And so, as the auction continued, the girl remained on the platform, trembling and exposed, her heart heavy with despair. She had been rejected by all around her, abandoned without protection or dignity. Yet, even in that pit of hopelessness, the quiet presence at the edge of the crowd hinted that her story was far from over. While the crowd continued to murmur, shift, and whisper judgments, a subtle change began to occur at the edges of the square. There, apart from the laughter and ridicule, stood a solitary figure, a man unlike anyone else present. His posture was calm, almost statuesque, and his gaze held a quiet intensity that seemed to pierce through the chaos. He did not approach the platform immediately, nor did he shout or call attention to himself. Instead, he observed with patient scrutiny, his eyes following the girl as she trembled and shivered atop the auction platform. Unlike the rest of the crowd, he did not see her as an object to be bought, nor as a spectacle to be mocked. He saw something deeper fragility, yes, but also a spark of resilience buried beneath layers of fear and shame. The girl, caught in her own whirlwind of despair, noticed him almost instinctively. There was something different about his gaze, not cold or dismissive, not curious or cruel. It held a quiet steadiness, a recognition of her existence beyond the surface of the auction. Her heart, still heavy with rejection, stirred slightly at the realization that someone was looking at her not as a commodity, but as a person. It was a strange and foreign sensation, like the first warmth of the sun after a long, bitter winter. She dared a cautious glance toward him, and for the briefest moment, their eyes met. In that exchange, unspoken yet profound, a connection began to form. He did not smile, did not extend a hand, and yet there was a promise in his gaze, a silent acknowledgment that she was not entirely alone. The crowd continued its noise, indifferent and judgmental, but at the edge of her vision, this solitary figure remained still, steadfast. His presence was a stark contrast to the chaos around her, a quiet anchor in a world that had offered her nothing but abandonment and scorn. The auctioneer, unaware of this silent connection, called again, his voice sharp and impatient. "Who will bid? Surely someone must take her." The words, meant to elicit action, only deepened the girl's sense of isolation. No hands rose, no coins were offered. And yet, amid the empty responses, the man at the edge of the crowd did not turn away. He remained, watching, considering. His eyes did not waver, and in that constancy, the girl felt a faint flicker of hope, a fragile lifeline she had not thought possible mere moments before. It was not hope born of certainty, for she could not yet imagine escape or safety. It was hope in the form of possibility, a whisper that somewhere, beyond this platform and these people, someone might see her worth. The man's presence reminded her that not all eyes were cruel, not all hearts indifferent. And for the first time since being brought to the auction, she felt the stirrings of trust, not yet fully realized, but present, delicate, and growing. He shifted slightly, his movement minimal yet deliberate, and in that subtle gesture she sensed care. He did not approach the platform or demand her attention. He merely existed in proximity, offering a form of quiet protection. In the midst of her despair, that presence alone became a source of comfort. She clutched herself tighter, not from fear, but as if drawing strength from the knowledge that someone recognized her humanity. The crowd's murmurs continued, a dull roar in her ears, but the man remained separate, an island of calm. For a fleeting moment, she allowed herself to imagine what it might feel like to be seen without judgment, to be acknowledged not as an object to be bought or discarded, but as a human being deserving of care. It was a dangerous indulgence, she knew, yet she could not help it. The tiny spark of hope warmed her chest like a timid fire in the cold morning air. And so, while the auction carried on, the girl's despair was tempered by this glimmer of hope. Among a sea of rejection, there was one presence that hinted at something more, a possibility that not all were cruel, that not all hearts were closed. Somewhere in the quiet, unwavering gaze of this man, the first thread of a new chapter was beginning to form, fragile yet unmistakably real. The auction continued around them, the clamor of voices rising and falling like waves. But the girl's attention had shifted entirely to the solitary figure at the edge of the crowd. She felt a pull she could not explain, a strange mixture of curiosity and tentative trust. He had been watching her with quiet patience, never mocking, never forcing his presence. And now, as he began to move closer, her heart raced with a mix of fear and cautious hope. His steps were deliberate, careful not to draw unnecessary attention. Unlike the auctioneer's booming voice or the impatient murmurs of the crowd, his approach carried a quiet authority, a confidence that seemed grounded in experience rather than command. As he reached the base of the platform, he stopped, his gaze meeting hers. It was steady, calm, and free from judgment, a stark contrast to the prying, often cruel eyes that had surrounded her moments before. For a moment, the world seemed to narrow to just the two of them. She noticed the details she hadn't before, the lines of thoughtfulness etched into his face, the careful way he adjusted the strap of his worn bag, the deliberate steadiness in his stance. It was not a threatening presence, it was a protective one. She felt an instinctive recognition, as if he carried with him a promise that things might not always be as they had been, harsh, cold, and rejecting. "You don't have to stay here," he said softly, his voice carrying across the distance but without the sharpness of the auctioneer's calls. "You don't belong in a place like this." There was no coercion in his tone, no hint of pity, just a simple truth, spoken gently. Lips parted, but no words came. She had grown accustomed to silence as a shield, a means of surviving the cruelty around her. Yet somehow, the sound of his voice, calm and unhurried, made her feel as though speaking might not be dangerous. It might even be safe. "I can take you somewhere," he continued, shifting slightly to emphasize the offer without stepping onto the platform. "Somewhere you'll be safe, somewhere they won't treat you like this." He gestured lightly, encompassing the platform, the crowd, the harsh reality she had been trapped in for hours. There was an understanding in his words, a recognition of her suffering, but not a demand for gratitude or obedience. The girl's chest tightened with fear. Trust had been a fragile thing for her, easily shattered, and she had learned to hide behind walls of caution. She hesitated, unsure whether to leap into the unknown or remain in the miserable familiarity of rejection. But something about his gaze, the patience in his posture, the quiet strength that radiated from him, began to chip away at her fear. "You won't have to do anything you don't want to," he said, reading the hesitation on her face. "I'll be here, but the choice is yours." His words were not a command, nor a bargaining chip. They were a lifeline extended without strings, a hand offered without expectation. The girl swallowed hard, her mind racing. No one had ever spoken to her this way before. No one had offered safety without judgment. Slowly, ever so slowly, she nodded, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement that carried the weight of a lifetime of fear and abandonment. He reached up carefully. not touching her without permission, and offered a small blanket he had carried, draping it over her trembling shoulders. It was a simple gesture, yet it carried a world of meaning. The warmth against her skin, both physical and emotional, was a revelation. She felt for the first time in a long while that someone recognized her humanity, not as property, not as an object to be discarded, but as a person worthy of care and protection. Around them, the auction continued, but it faded into irrelevance. The crowd's indifference, their whispers, and their judgment became background noise. In that quiet, suspended moment, a bridge was formed between the abandoned girl and the solitary man who had seen her not as a commodity, but as a human being. And with that bridge, fragile yet real, the first step toward rescue, trust, and a new beginning was taken. The crowd's murmurs continued, but the man's focus never wavered from the girl. He watched her closely, noting the way her small body shivered beneath the thin blanket he had offered, how her eyes darted nervously to the auctioneer and the indifferent onlookers. He knew that if she remained on that platform, exposed and rejected, she would be left vulnerable to more than just ridicule. Each passing second without intervention tightened the chains of despair around her. The decision was clear. He could not wait for someone else to act. She needed him, and he would not let her be abandoned any longer. He moved deliberately toward the auctioneer, whose attention was still occupied by the crowd. The man's presence commanded quiet authority, and though he spoke softly, his tone carried a weight that made the auctioneer pause. "She's coming with me," he said simply, without negotiation or hesitation. The words hung in the air, leaving no room for argument. The auctioneer blinked, momentarily taken aback. "Excuse me? You can't just she hasn't been sold," he stammered, trying to assert control. But the man's gaze was unwavering, calm yet firm. There was no malice, no threat, only a quiet insistence that left no room for refusal. "She is not for sale. She does not belong here," he replied, his voice steady. The auctioneer's protest faltered under the weight of that certainty, and the surrounding crowd began to murmur with curiosity and unease. The girl watched the interaction with a mix of fear and hope. She had been rejected by everyone, treated as an object, but now, for the first time, someone was speaking on her behalf, not for gain, not for spectacle, but out of genuine care. Her trembling eased slightly as she realized she did not have to make this leap alone. He was guiding her, protecting her. Some of the onlookers began to react. A few muttered complaints, their indignation thinly veiled. "Who does he think he is?" One man whispered, "She's the auctioneer's property until someone buys her." Others, more cautious, simply watched, unsure how to respond. The crowd's judgmental energy created tension, but the man remained unshaken. He had acted decisively, and his resolve radiated a sense of inevitability. She would leave with him, whether the others approved or not. He stepped closer to the platform, offering his hand to the girl. "It's time to go," he said gently. "You'll be safe now. You don't have to be afraid anymore." His words were simple, but they carried the promise of protection, the assurance of a refuge she had never known. The girl hesitated for only a heartbeat before placing her small hand in his, a gesture that symbolized trust and the first step toward freedom. With careful precision, he helped her descend from the platform. The crowd parted just enough to allow them to pass, a mix of curiosity, disbelief, and resentment rippling through those who had been watching. The girl's bare feet touched the dusty ground, and for the first time she felt solid footing beneath her, not just physically, but emotionally. She was leaving behind the cruelty, the humiliation, and the despair of the auction, and stepping into the unknown, guided by someone who genuinely cared. As they walked away, he kept a protective arm close, ensuring no one in the crowd could harass or interfere. She clung to him not out of fear alone, but out of the fragile trust that had begun to form in the quiet moments before this decisive act. Each step forward was a reclamation of dignity, each movement away from the auction a small victory over the rejection she had endured for so long. In that moment, it became clear that her life would never be the same. The decision to rescue her was not just an act of kindness, it was a turning point, a deliberate choice to break the cycle of abandonment that had defined her existence. And though the path ahead remained uncertain, one truth was undeniable. For the first time, she had someone in her corner, someone who would not let her be discarded again. The murmurs of the crowd faded behind them as they walked away, leaving the platform and her past behind. Ahead lay safety, care, and the possibility of a future she had never dared to imagine. The town square gradually receded behind them, the clamor of the auction fading into the distance. With each step, the girl felt a mixture of relief and nervous anticipation. She had never left the confines of her small, harsh world before, and the open path ahead was both exhilarating and terrifying. The man walked beside her with quiet confidence, his presence a steady reassurance that she could rely on. Though she did not yet know where they were going, the certainty in his stride gave her a tentative sense of hope. The journey was slow and deliberate. Dust rose under their feet as they moved along winding paths that cut through sparse woodlands and open fields. The sun climbed higher, its warmth contrasting with the chill of the morning, casting shifting shadows across the landscape. The girl clutched the blanket he had offered earlier tightly around her shoulders, feeling its warmth seep into her skin, a small comfort against the lingering shivers. Each step away from the auction platform felt like shedding layers of fear and humiliation, though remnants of the past clung stubbornly to her spirit. The man spoke little, but when he did, his words were calm, practical, and gentle. "You'll be safe soon," he said at one point, pausing to ensure she was keeping pace. "There's water ahead. You can rest and eat." The promise of sustenance, of a simple meal and a place to sit without judgment, made her stomach tighten with relief. It was a small thing, yet monumental for someone who had been treated as unwanted and disposable. At intervals, he glanced at her to gauge her comfort and well-being. When her steps faltered, he slowed to match her pace, offering a steady hand or a supportive arm. She found herself leaning into his presence, not out of dependence alone, but because it felt safe. In the quiet of the journey, away from the cruel eyes of the auction, she began to notice small details about him, the way he moved with quiet grace, the care in his gaze, and the patience that seemed to define every gesture. It was the first time she had experienced a presence that did not demand anything of her, that did not judge her for being vulnerable. As they reached a shaded glen, he paused and gestured for her to sit on a smooth rock beside a small stream. Water bubbled over stones, clear and cool, and he knelt beside her, offering a cloth to wipe the dust from her skin. The simple act of care, of tending to her physical needs without expectation or ridicule, was transformative. She drank the water, its cold clarity refreshing her parched throat, while he prepared a small bundle of food. The smell of warm bread and dried meat reminded her of comforts she had long believed were out of reach. Throughout the journey, silence often settled between them, but it was never empty. In the quiet moments, a subtle trust began to form. She watched his careful movements, his attentiveness to the path and to her, and felt the beginnings of a connection she had never experienced before. It was not instantaneous, but gradual, like a fragile seed beginning to take root in soil that had long been barren. As the sun began its slow descent, casting golden light across the trees, she felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the day's fading heat. It was a sense of security, of being seen and protected, that she had never known. With each step and each gesture of care, The man was teaching her, without words, that safety and kindness were possible, even in a world that had long taught her otherwise. By the time they reached the edge of a quiet clearing, the girl's trembling had eased. Her bare feet, dusty and sore, had grown accustomed to the uneven ground, and her mind began to open to the idea that she might survive, might even thrive. The journey had been more than a physical escape. It had been the first step toward reclaiming her dignity and trust, and though the road ahead remained unknown, the girl realized for the first time that she was not alone. The man walking beside her, steady, patient, unwavering, had become more than a rescuer. He was a protector, a guide, and perhaps in time, a doorway to a life she had never dared to imagine. The clearing opened into a small, secluded village nestled among gentle hills and shaded by tall, protective trees. Smoke curled lazily from a few modest dwellings, and the sounds of daily life, laughter, conversation, the rhythm of work flowed gently through the air. The girl paused at the edge, her heart pounding. She had never seen a place like this, a world apart from judgment and cruelty, a space that seemed alive with warmth, care, and belonging. The man, her silent guide, led her through the village. Children played nearby, their eyes curious but not cruel, and adults glanced her way with calm acknowledgement rather than derision. For the first time in her life, she did not feel like an object to be evaluated or discarded. She was simply a person, arriving as she was, without the burden of shame or expectation. He introduced her quietly, speaking on her behalf, ensuring she felt safe. "She has traveled far and needs rest," he said, his tone both protective and respectful. The villagers accepted this without question, offering food, blankets, and gentle smiles. It was a rhythm of care entirely foreign to her, and at first she felt awkward, almost distrustful. But each act of kindness chipped away at the walls she had built to protect herself. Over the days that followed, the girl began to settle into the village's rhythm. She learned small tasks, helped gather water, and observed the elders and children with cautious curiosity. Each interaction was a step toward trust. When a child invited her to join a game, she hesitated, then accepted, laughing softly when she stumbled but was met with nothing but encouragement. Each smile, each nod, each word of inclusion was a thread weaving her back into the fabric of human connection. The man remained a constant presence, patient and attentive, never forcing her to act or feel more than she was ready to. His guidance was gentle, his support unwavering. At night, he would sit nearby, a silent sentinel, allowing her to sleep without fear. Slowly, her trembling ceased, replaced by a growing sense of safety. She began to sleep through the night, her dreams no longer haunted by the auction platform or the indifferent eyes of strangers. The healing extended beyond the physical. She began to find her voice again, first in whispers to herself, then in conversations with those who had welcomed her. Her laughter, tentative at first, grew stronger. Her gaze, once downcast and wary, began to meet others' eyes with curiosity and courage. The layers of shame, humiliation, and fear that had burdened her for so long were gradually replaced by a sense of self-worth and belonging. The community's care also nurtured her understanding of connection and empathy. She observed the way neighbors supported each other, how kindness was not transactional but natural. Slowly, she absorbed these lessons, learning that safety and compassion were not privileges but rights she could embrace. The acts of others became mirrors reflecting the humanity she had almost forgotten she possessed. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the hills and painted the village in golden hues, the man approached her with a quiet smile. "You've come a long way," he said, "not just in distance, but in heart." She looked around at the village, the children laughing, the adults working together, the gentle hum of life, and realized it was true. She had traveled farther than she had imagined, not just across the land, but through fear, pain, and despair. The first time, she felt whole. The wound of abandonment had not vanished entirely, but it had been softened by the steady presence of those who cared. She was no longer naked in body or spirit. She had been seen, valued, and accepted. And in that acceptance, she found not only healing but hope, a promise that her life, once defined by rejection and despair, could now be shaped by compassion, belonging, and love. Time passed in the village, measured not in days or months alone, but in quiet moments of growth and connection. The girl once abandoned, naked, and invisible had begun to transform. Each day brought new experiences, learning the ways of the community, helping with daily tasks, playing and laughing with children who had once been strangers, and observing the elders whose wisdom carried patience and care. Slowly she learned, not just to survive, but to live fully, to trust, and to believe in her own worth. The Apache who had rescued her remained by her side, though his guidance had evolved. No longer merely a protector, he became a mentor, teaching her practical skills, guiding her understanding of the world, and showing her the strength of quiet resilience. He never forced her, never demanded compliance, only offered wisdom and care. Through him, she began to understand the profound difference between fear-driven authority and the power of empathy, respect, and human connection. The girl's once hesitant smile now appeared freely, a reflection of the inner light that had been almost extinguished by rejection. She laughed with abandon in the fields, her voice carrying across the village, and she began to speak openly with others, sharing small thoughts, questions, and observations. The villagers embraced her not as a newcomer to be judged or tested, but as one of their own, a member of the community whose presence enriched their collective life. Each acknowledgement of her humanity reinforced her healing, reinforcing the truth that she was worthy of love, care, and belonging. Her transformation was not only emotional but also physical. The blanket that had once been a lifeline now seemed symbolic of her past vulnerability, replaced by clothing and adornments provided by her new community. Each item carried not just warmth and protection, but dignity and external reflection of the growing confidence within. She carried herself differently now, not arrogantly, but with a quiet assurance that came from being valued for who she was rather than judged for what she had been. The bond between her and the Apache deepened. She came to understand his quiet strength, his patience, and the compassion that had led him to rescue her. She admired him not just as a savior, but as a guide who had shown her the possibility of hope and resilience. In his presence, she felt safe enough to explore the deepest parts of her own heart, to acknowledge her past without being defined by it. The trauma of abandonment remained, but it no longer dictated her every thought. It became a shadow that reminded her of her journey rather than a chain that bound her. One afternoon, as they watched the sunset together from a gentle hillside, she realized the magnitude of her transformation. The sky, painted in hues of gold and crimson, mirrored the sense of possibility that now filled her life. She had traveled from a place of despair and invisibility to a life rich with connection, care, and meaning. The girl who had once stood exposed and unwanted on an auction platform was now a young woman with a voice, a home, and a community that cherished her dot in her heart. She carried gratitude not just for the Apache who had saved her, but for the countless moments of kindness, trust, and acceptance that had allowed her to heal. She had learned that human connection could be transformative, that a single act of courage and compassion could change the course of a life. She had been given a second chance, a chance to grow, to love, and to belong. And as she looked toward the horizon, the possibilities stretched endlessly before her. The world that had once rejected her was no longer the only reality she knew. With hope firmly rooted in her heart and the support of those who truly saw her, she stepped forward into a future of her own making, a life defined not by abandonment, but by resilience, belonging, and the enduring power of human kindness.